We'll continue with our coverage of the Mackinac Policy Conference and take you into the next session right now called Data to Make a Difference.
Especially when it comes to research on race relation and equity. One of the biggest challenge that we had to contend with is just the way research is done in the cyclical way. We find ourselves now today coming off of the summer of social justice with the murder of George Floyd, but also the disparities that were highlighted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we realize that not all things are equal when it comes to how we experience our lives. And so as part of that interrogation, we said, well, how can we start in a meaningful way? And the first thing is really how we are established as a center. So it's our flagship initiative devoted to studying and highlighting the experience of the more than 40 million Black Americans that live in our society, tracking progress and outcomes towards a life well lived. And you see that I have this thing that popped up, which is a 100-year commitment. And that is truly a commitment that, despite when salience and prevalence of this conversation wanes, it's a commitment to continue this work for the next 100 years. And while we hope that we don't have this problem for the next 100 years, it's a commitment that we will continue to study and measure and to understand what the Black experience is like and to understand what progress we're making or not making. I think other than the what is the Center on Black Voices and what are you doing, I think the other question that I get asked the most is, why is Gallup doing this? What does this have to do with polls and election polling? Well, I would like to say that we've always done this as an organization. So for the last 85 years, how we've leveraged our reputation for research rigor, but also as public trust, where we are measuring and monitoring public opinion, is this idea that we use this trust in public opinion research to establish new measures that shape global conversations. So this is something that we do naturally through our work with the public sector. One of that being in that our work and the research that we do help do some incredible things today for the United Nations, whether it is modern day slavery, so understanding what modern day slavery looks like and its prevalence in our global world today, or it is about financial inclusion. So this is really understanding what access looks like for individuals and businesses when it comes to receiving financial products and services that help meet individual needs, but also boost opportunity for financial growth or financial opportunities that are afforded to people through financial index. And that is also another sustainable development goal that we track and measure for the World Bank. And a third and final one is this idea of we're also the institution that is measuring food insecurity. So when we think about our goal of ending hunger and food insecurity across the world, this is a measure that we track and monitor on a yearly basis of how well we're doing towards meeting those goals and aspirations that we have. So this idea of leveraging measurement and understanding that there is no progress without measurement and really tackling complex world issues and problems is not something that's new to us in terms of the way we operate and show up for our clients. And so that's also one of the things that we heard from our associates when we contemplated what do we want to do and how can we provide meaningful input to the conversation and the change that's needed. And that's why we created the Center on Black Voices, as that way of saying, let's bring the same way we show up for our clients authentically, let's bring this idea of research rigor, understanding the human experience when it comes to advancing racial equity in our society. Well, what are we doing? We have 6 key research pillars at the center. And the reason why we landed on these 6 research areas, when we want to know and to understand, well, where are those manifestations of systemic disparities? How do they show up in our lives in terms of the opportunities and the abilities that Black Americans have to lead a life well lived or to achieve equitable outcomes? And we know that the intersections and the way we live and experience our lives and what gets manifested in terms of opportunity and access cuts across these 6 key research areas. And so you see justice, health and well-being, economic opportunity, jobs and work, education, and community and environment. And what we're hoping to do at the center is to create this listening machine that we are constantly measuring key metrics. We're calling them the Sustainable Development Goals for Black America. And it's really coming up with measures that are responsive to self-report data. This is responsive to how people's lives are going and being impacted across these 6 research areas, and providing those insights and discoveries from the center to policymakers in terms of creating evidence and insights as to what Black Americans' perceptions are, what their experience is across these 6 areas, and where are those expectations for change. Another thing in terms of the way we're structured at the center, and I mentioned that this process started with self-interrogation. It also is a process about humble curiosity. We wanted to create a center that provides this listening machine that creates research in a very inclusive way. So it's not just research on Black Americans, but it's research with Black Americans. And so there are a number of other limitations that we had to realize that the way we design and how we're executing on our mission, we had to ensure that some of those issues and limitations that as an industry, we are designed to address. One of them being just a sustainable effort. I mentioned that research around race relations tend to be cyclical. And so when you ask the question, are things getting better or worse, you always get that response, it depends. It depends on what you're measuring. It depends on what the last measurement was. And so the idea is that we will ensure that we're constantly measuring and tracking the experience of Black Americans across those 6 research areas. And in an effort to make this accessible in democratizing data, what we will do is to allow for all of this research to be publicly accessible. Because what we know that access to research and information for decision making has been a barrier and a limitation for quite some time in terms of how do we ensure that we're amplifying Black voices and lending these experiences into those conversations where individuals are having conversations around change and what needs to happen when it comes to advancing racial equity. Another big piece in terms of what we realized as a center that we had to be intentional about is also how we're executing and leveraging this research. We understand the data, the power of data and the use of measurement when it comes to being able to enact change. But what we know is that people's experiences vary widely based on geography. And so as part of the work that we do at the center, we look for local partnerships to provide hyperlocal data so that we can highlight the experiences of residents at an actionable level for which change will be enacted. So when you start to think about cities and how we experience our lives differently based on where we live and where those solutions will come from that will impact our lives and our everyday experience, doing that through partnerships, providing hyperlocal data and actionable data for collective action was part of the way that we knew we wanted to be intentional with how we were executing on our mission. And the point of, so what have we found so far? So we've had 8 studies since our launch in July 15th, 2020. And what we're realizing is the impact that data is having to that conversation. The first being tracking progress towards change. And I have 2 key measures up there, and every quarter we're tracking people's experiences with mistreatment and discrimination. And what we're finding is that when we ask people about everyday scenarios and everyday experiences, whether it's shopping in retail, whether it's going to a restaurant and receiving less courteous service, to more egregious actions of being physically or verbally assaulted in your daily interactions, we see that Black Americans experience it differently. So they're disproportionately more likely to report having these negative experiences with mistreatment. Why is that important for tracking? If we're really moving towards racial equity, accepting our humanity and how we treat each other and relate with each other is important. So that's a measure that we are also tracking. And I want to go through in terms of some other key areas, it's really about amplifying Black voices. We have measures around justice that looks at what are Black Americans' desire when it comes to the need to be safe in their communities and their neighborhoods. And what we are seeing is that that is particularly important when it comes to the narrative that to say Black Lives Matter is to be anti-police. Well, that's not the case, because what we see and learn is that Black Americans are just as likely to say that they want the police to spend more time or the same amount of time in their communities because of their desire to being safe and wanting to be safe in their communities. But what we do know is that they don't want to be brutalized when they have their interactions with their police, and our research shows that they're disproportionately more likely to have negative interactions with the police. So having the ability to track progress around these and to redefine the measures that we have are the ways that we're using our data and leveraging our data to influence the conversation, to show the disparities that exist within our society, but also in our experiences. So when we start to think about what change looks like, we understand whether or not we're making progress or not. I'll just quickly share just one measure around health equity. So this past February, we had it was health and wellness was the theme. And so we had a measure to really try to understand what is this idea of quality and health quality, and what does that look like in the conversation towards health equity? Well, what we understand in terms of asking people about their availability or ease of access to finding a provider of their racial background or ethnic background and experience. And we see that Black adults are disproportionately less likely to say that it's easy or somewhat easy for them to find culturally responsive care. Well, why is a measure like this important for us to track and understand? It's important for us to track and understand because we now know and understand the impact that having culturally responsive care has to this definition of what it means to receive quality health care beyond just whether or not you have access to a doctor. We see that those who have access to culturally responsive care are significantly less likely to report having these negative experiences when they are receiving care. So we start to think about what are those important measures based on people's experiences, based on their perception, but also based on their expectations for change. And by understanding if we are continuing to improve, whether it's increasing diversity or reducing the disparities, what we should see is these changes in people's experiences when they're encountering these different systems in terms of the measures that we're tracking. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Joining Camille Lloyd on stage, please welcome Matt Elliott, President of Bank of America, Michigan, Angelique Power, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Skillman Foundation, and to moderate the discussion, Sandy Baruah, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Detroit Regional Chamber.
All right. Camille, thank you. That was awesome. We needed a bigger flourish at the end, but that was absolutely awesome. I know one thing is going to happen during this panel, and that is we're going to run out of time because we have so much to talk about. But Camille, thank you for bringing this vision to us. Angelique, Matt, thank you for being a part of this, and thanks for sharing your valuable time with us here. So I actually want to start with an announcement, a little, non-Mackinac, but the Center on Black Voices, where Camille serves as executive director, has been working with the Chamber and a whole group of organizations, we're going to get into that, for almost 2 years now. And I am very proud to say that the Center on Black Voices is coming to Detroit. And we're going to, thank you, yeah. And we will have, and I want to celebrate the folks who are helping to make that happen. And I think we have a slide somewhere coming up. The Gilbert Family Foundation, the Song Family Foundation, the Skillman Foundation, DTE Foundation, Bank of America, Barton Mallow, Henry Ford Health, and Piston Sports and Entertainment are all agreed to be with us and help bring the Center on Black Voices. And we still have asks out. So operators are standing by. Feel free to call anytime. We're happy to do that. So I want to celebrate that because we're so excited, Camille, to be able to work with the Center on Black Voices. But it's not just the Center on Black Voices. And Angelique, I want to start with you. We are all part, everyone on this stage and many more, of something called the Racial Equity Blueprint Group. And Skillman is a key part of that and was a founder of that. Talk to us about the Blueprint Group and Skillman's role in kind of helping to birth this.
So Camille talked about a few years ago when we witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And I think it's important to remember that this is a few years into the pandemic, a few months into the pandemic, and that the world was sort of on pause at that moment. And so when this happened, there was a collective, there were uprisings that were led across the world by young Black and brown people in particular. But there was also a moment within each and every person and institution of saying, like, we have to take action and we have to do something differently. So my predecessor, the mighty Tanya Allen, actually reached out and made some phone calls and asked people to come and sit at a table. And while it was a like-minded table, it was unlikely folks to sit there. And the conversation began while she was at Skillman, with some staffing from Skillman that was also offered, and I want to shout out Jessica Anders, who's really been working hard with the Blueprint Group. But what's happened is that it's one thing to set a table and to start a conversation. It's another thing to have people come back week after week after week. And Matt was part of those initial conversations, and Sandy, you were too, and some folks that are in the audience. I think the realization in the beginning was that, change moves at the speed of trust, and trust moves at the speed of relationships. So I assume, from what I've heard, there was grieving, there was processing, and then that changed to mobilizing. And so where we are today is that the Blueprint Group has moved beyond some initial organizations, which actually I wanted to shout out all of the initial folks. It was Detroit Future City, New Detroit, United Way, the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights inside of Wayne State University, Fisher Foundation, Bank of America, and Skillman. So lots of folks that were involved. And then since then, there have been outreach to hundreds of others to come and join the table as it moves into actually concretizing in two strands. There's a data strand of local data researchers, and I can talk more about that later, that will work hand in hand with Gallup to make sense of this data. But then there's also an education strand. And I think that's really important because 2 years later, we're facing backlash of even talking about race, of even acknowledging racism. And certainly we're looking at book bans and bans in schools for having these sorts of conversations. So education is one strand of the Blueprint Group, data collection is another strand, and that's how it's starting to concretize.
Yes. Camille, when we look at the members of the data group, they're fortunately on this slide right here, and the Gallup Center on Black Voices is a member of this data group. You've been at that table now for almost 2 years. Can you talk a little bit about, your approach and Camille and Justin's approach that they've been taking, over these almost 2 years now to really work with the community as opposed to, just providing something to the community?
Absolutely. I think one of the things in order to be successful this work is to be inclusive. And I mentioned earlier that it's about approaching it with humility. And that means despite, all the experience around research and background, when we come in to work with a community, you all are the experts, you all have your own data. So understanding really the goal is to provide a common premise that leads to collective action and having actionable data. And you cannot do that without working with organizations and individuals that are on the ground who live in those communities. And so as part of that work, it's going into the city to say, what would meaningful data look like for your city? What is it that you all are interested and driven and passionate about in terms of advancing racial equity? What does it mean to achieve racial equity within Detroit? And understanding that the players at the table who are the individuals who've devoted their lives, their careers, or their organization's mission, those are the individuals who are best suited to say, well, how does data play a role and how will that be helpful for you all? And so that's the approach that we are taking at the center, is to really approach it with with humility and curiosity to say, what is it going to take to have impact and create change in people's lives?
Matt, I'm going to have two questions for you. So first, I want to take a step back. So you're a prominent business leader working for one of the world's best known corporations. I think many of us, including myself, have been struck by your personal passion around this issue. Just taking a step back, what has kind of brought you, Matt Elliott, to this conversation?
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be at that table. And I can tell you I've learned a lot through the process. I think Sandy, it really starts with not so much me, but why is our organization at the table? And there's an inside and an outside reason. The inside reason is that diversity and inclusion is a core part of our business strategy. We define one of the core pillars of our responsible growth strategy as being we got to grow sustainably. To do that, we've got to be a great place to work. So what we say to ourselves is, can you bring your whole self to work? And that means the mantle of leadership that falls on me is to be someone who can demonstrate that so that everyone who works on our team feels like they're sponsored. Their voice is there. It's present in the room when they might not be present, right? So that's the internal piece. The external piece is we also feel like as an organization, we like to exercise what we call the power of the and. And what I mean by that is we can deliver for stakeholders and shareholders, and we can help solve big challenges. And clearly, these barriers to economic mobility and just barriers in our society generally are big challenges. And so when we do things like, we decided and we announced a $1.25 billion commitment over 5 years to driving and breaking down systemic barriers to economic mobility. We do that really because we also feel like that's our obligation. It's good for us for business, by the way, but we also think it's our job as part of the global society to do it. And why is that resonant to me? Really because I think a lot of it has to do with my mom. So my mom growing up was someone who started her career as an admitting clerk at Lansing General Hospital. And someone walked in one day and said, "Surely you're like the Rock of Gibraltar, you'll be here forever." She quit that day. 8 years later, she had a master's degree from Michigan State while raising my brother Joe and me. And then, she would always tell me about the struggles that she had trying to establish her career in the 70s as a woman. And so I've always thought about that as a leader, that I want to be able to be that kind of a person who is speaking for folks who aren't always in the room, because I get a chance to be in that room.
So my second question, as promised. So businesses are data-driven. I would say financial institutions are even more data-driven.
You got it.
So this is an issue, as important as it is, has had varying levels of kind of data backing it up. What have you seen in your time since the murder of George Floyd and the advent of the Blueprint Group? Talk to us about kind of your and Bank of America's engagement in this, and what has kept you at that table?
Well, I'll start with the second piece of that first. I think what keeps us at the table is because of the fact that this is core to our strategy. What's new, I think, is that we're not alone or as alone as we might have been pre-George Floyd or pre-pandemic. That increasingly people are recognizing this idea of being a great place to work, of being inclusive, of driving ESG, has lots of positive effects. We know that, from an operating point of view, that companies that have diverse management teams make better decisions, they're more profitable. We know that they're more attractive to consumers. They're more attractive to prospective employers. And so all of those things are kind of like the business case. And I think increasingly folks also realize that if you really want to have a great culture, you have to be human. And the old saying is that culture eats strategy for lunch. And I think it's true. And so under both headings, you need to drive a culture that is inclusive and human. But at the same time, this idea behind supporting and nurturing your human resources is real, and this is a part of it.
Angelique, you mentioned in your opening comments about how there's now starting to see a little bit of a backlash about conversations about racial equity and efforts to close the racial equity gap. In the days, weeks, and months after the murder of George Floyd and other incidents that have occurred, there was a lot of talk about this time it's different. What is your perspective on, is this time different? How so, or if not?
So real talk.
Better here than any other place.
No, I don't think if you, and people have done this, they've looked at the racial equity statements that were made, and there were lots of grand gestures, and so far that's really what they have been. They've been gestural. And I think there's a misunderstanding of what equity is. It's so overused and misunderstood. It really isn't just about representation, although that's extremely important, or belonging, although that's a component of what makes things successful. It is shifting power and shifting resources. It's following the money where it's going inside of any institution. It's accountability, where communities hold us accountable. It is transparency. It's recognizing our privilege, and asking who has ownership, who's making decisions on behalf of whom. And so the work has stalled from the moment that I was getting, racial equity proclamations from, Sephora or different places. And I think that where we are now is learning how to do the daily work of operationalizing it, which is something that every institution needs to do, including, and especially, I might add, philanthropy. Mm-hmm. So how do we take a look at ourselves, look at how we fund, who we fund, metrics that we place, validation systems that we have, budget thresholds. We did a racial equity audit at the Skillman Foundation this year, where we looked at where every penny we're spending goes by race. And we looked at that for our grantees, which is extremely important, but we looked at that for our endowment, that's where the majority of the money is. And we looked at that for each vendor that we use. We are in a process of sitting with community and listening sessions and learning what they need us to keep doing, what they need us to stop doing. And as we move through a process of change, this racial equity audit will be released. Because data is powerful, and it needs to be used to hold us accountable to whom we've made these racial equity statements on behalf of. So that's part of the Blueprint group, is to come together and move beyond talk, but to really add teeth to these statements and start with ourselves to demonstrate change, and then collaborate with this 100-year commitment so that we sync to what's happening nationally.
So Matt, please. Matt, building off of what Angelique just said, it's unfair to ask you to speak for corporate America, but Matt, please speak for corporate America. I see Jeff Donofrio here. We could ask him to speak for. But Angelique, I think, was very candid, saying that, hey, there's all these great statements made by corporate America. How do you think corporate America is doing in living up to the pledges that were made in the summer of 2020?
Well, I think because of what Angelique just said, that it takes a while to operationalize this. There's probably a gap between knowing that and acknowledging this, there's work to be done, and then actually putting it to work. However, with, I'll call it the weaponization of this discussion, it becomes increasingly risky. Because if you're really going to start this work honestly, you've got to admit and you've got to understand and acknowledge and talk about the fact that systemic racism exists. Mm-hmm. And if you're somebody like me who grew up in DeWitt, Michigan, I didn't experience it then, and I probably don't ever experience it now. The only reason I do is because I see the data. I have friends like Angelique and other friends in the audience who shoot me straight, and I get a chance to live through their eyes, like their lived experience. It's one of the values of the data that we're going to gather from Gallup. So that's a risky proposition. And then if you're going to take it further, I'm looking at a banker colleague of mine who I've known for about 25 years. Like when Eric and I are in places with other folks like us, say at the country club, let's use the most banker cliche we can. Are you talking about race? Are you talking about equity? Are you talking about gender equity? I can tell you, since George Floyd, I've actually done that.
Yeah.
I've had rounds of golf ruined because I got off on this big tangent around race. Gratefully, actually. But the point is that I would say it's going to be incremental, but if and when, and there are these organizations out there for sure, who integrate this thinking, this work into their work, like the way that the Chamber has done it by adding a racial equity lens to the data reporting, the way Business Leaders has done that, the way lots of companies have begun to report out on human capital. What gets measured gets done. And consequently, if this is part of the measurement, this is part of your scorecard, then I think this is something that can persist for a long period of time. However, the beginning of this conversation requires risk.
Camille, you all started this in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. Been at it for 2 years now, specifically here in Detroit, where you're working with all of these organizations that flashed up on screen and others. What are you seeing in terms of the effort around this work? The work to close racial equity gaps. Here you are, the big Gallup organization with your wonderful offices in Washington, D.C., and you're working with these very small, on-the-ground organizations. I can only imagine how some of that gets received. In fact, we've all been kind of part of those discussions about why is this Gallup organization here? How do you overcome that? And then how do you build those relationships, especially as the effort goes on and becomes harder over time?
I wore my Gallup green too, Sandy, but I want to piggyback off something that both Matt and Angelique said about this idea of waning intensity. And we asked about organizations. So a part of the jobs and work study, we asked the question of employees or workers, are you seeing any of these changes that are manifested in how you're experiencing your work environment? And I would say it's just about a third who are saying, yes, I'm seeing changes in my organization's hiring practices, promotion practices, and policies. So part of that is really quantifying those experiences. Are people's experiences being impacted by these commitment or this moving from moment to movement or progress, whatever you call it, is being able to measure the impact or lack thereof that we're seeing. And so to your question, Sandy, about, how do you overcome? I think if we are all of the same mind to say many hands make for light work, I think the data is just part of that conversation. It's not centering the data because it's really about centering change and impacting people's lives. And so in work, it's easy for us to say, as an organization that does research, we understand that there is no progress without measurement, but there is no progress without action. And so that just seeing the data as a critical piece, but not the only piece, right? And it's really kind of acknowledging that it will take a coalition to do this work and to be effective, where we start to see the change that we're looking for, which is Black Americans' ability to lead a life well lived and achieve equitable outcomes. So egos aside, if we're not all approaching this with understanding that we each bring different things to the table and acknowledging that if we are all collectively doing and targeting the same things, then that's where we're gonna start to see impact in people's lives. I think that was easy for us as Gallup to say, the data we don't have to be the ones that are leading it, because it's not our organizations that need to change the world. It's all of us that needs to make this a more equitable and just society.
So we're about to get the big gong. I want to end with two comments from two friends of all of ours who serve with us on the Racial Equity Blueprint group. One is Peter Hammer from the Damon Keith Center, and he constantly reminds all of us, that data is only data, right? That data in itself really doesn't do anything, but how do you use data as governance? And that's Peter's phrase, how to use data as governance. Yep. And the other one is our friend Doug Beninati-Stewart from the Max and Marjorie Fisher Foundation. And I tell you, he said this like on the second meeting, in the summer of 2020. And he said, if you ask a resident in the Rosemont neighborhood if they see another young, well-meaning person walk up to their porch carrying a clipboard, asking them questions about their lives, their first response is, what's different about this one than the 400 other people who've been walking up this porch over the last 40 years? How are you going to change my life? And I think those are two great comments to end on. Angelique, Camille, Matt, thank you so very, very much. Thank our panel, please.